In the opening months of the Pacific War, the ocean belonged to Japan. The stunning victory at Pearl Harbor was a spectacle of aerial dominance, a fiery declaration etched against the Hawaiian sky. But beneath the waves, a different, more silent arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy was already moving into position, a force that embodied a doctrine of strategic reach and ruthless efficiency. While the world watched the burning battleships, Japan's submarine fleet, the Sensuikan, began its war as it intended to continue, with audacious, long-range attacks that demonstrated a technological and tactical edge that left its enemies reeling. This was not the U-boat war of the Atlantic. Admiral Karl Donit's German packs were tactical weapons, designed to strangle the sea lanes of Britain through coordinated attacks on merchant convoys in a relatively confined theater. The Japanese submarine force, by contrast, was conceived as a strategic instrument from its inception. Its mission was to seek out and destroy the enemy's capital warships, to conduct long-range reconnaissance, and to project power across the unimaginable vastness of the Pacific Ocean. To accomplish this, they had built not just submarines, but some of the most advanced undersea vessels the world had ever seen. The crown jewels of this fleet were the I-class submarines. These were not mere boats, they were underwater cruisers. The Type B-1, for instance, was a masterpiece of naval engineering. Stretching over 350 feet from stem to stern, it displaced more than 2,500 tons submerged. Its range was staggering, nearly 14,000 nautical miles. This meant I-boat could sail from the home islands to the coast of California and back without refueling, or patrol the waters off Panama for weeks on end. It was armed with 6 forward torpedo tubes, carrying the formidable Type 95 torpedo. This was Japan's secret weapon, an oxygen-powered, long lance that left no telltale bubble wake, could travel over 10,000 yards, and carried a warhead larger than any Allied equivalent. In a single weapon, the Japanese held a qualitative advantage that would prove deadly. But the I-boats were more than just torpedo platforms. They were versatile naval assets. Many carried a reconnaissance seaplane, a Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn, housed in a watertight hangar forward of the conning tower. This tiny floatplane could be assembled and launched in a matter of minutes, transforming the submarine into a mobile, stealthy observation post, capable of scouting enemy harbors, spotting for fleets, or even, as would later be demonstrated, conducting symbolic bombing raids on the American mainland. Other giant submarines, the Sentoku class, were designed to carry not one, but 3 attack aircraft, conceived as strategic weapons to target cities like New York or Washington, D.C., a vision of undersea warfare so ambitious it was unmatched by any other nation. The early successes of this force were swift and psychologically devastating. Just days after Pearl Harbor, the I-26 torpedoed and damaged the USS Saratoga, temporarily sidelining a precious American aircraft carrier. In January 1942, the I-6 scored a hit on the carrier USS Saratoga, further depleting American naval power. But the submarines were not just hunters of warships, they were hunters of merchantmen, and they roamed with impunity. Off the coast of California, along the shipping lanes of Australia, and throughout the Dutch East Indies, Japanese submarines sent hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. They laid mines off major ports, further tightening a noose around Allied logistics. The pinnacle of this early dominance came in September 1942. The aircraft carrier USS Wasp, a veteran of the Atlantic and a critical asset for the beleaguered U.S. forces at Guadalcanal, was operating south of the Solomon Islands. The I-19, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Takechi Kanashi, fired a single, legendary spread of torpedoes. 1 salvo, 6 torpedoes. 3 found their mark in the Wasp, dooming the great ship. A 4th ran on to hit the battleship USS North Carolina, and a 5th struck the destroyer USS O'Brien, which later foundered. It was one of the most devastating submarine attacks in history. A stark demonstration of the lethality of Japanese torpedoes and the skill of their crews. For the crews of these submarines, the ocean was a dark, silent sanctuary. Their boats were faster and could dive deeper than most initial Allied estimates. Their torpedoes were superior. Their operational range was global. They operated with the confidence of masters in their domain, a confidence born of technological prowess and a string of uninterrupted victories. They were the Sensweeken, their silent hunters. And in the deep, shadowed silence of the Pacific, they believed they were untouchable. They moved like phantoms, striking from the void and then vanishing back into the abyss, leaving their enemies to wonder, to fear, and to search in vain for a foe they could not see and could not counter. The ocean, for the moment, was theirs. But a revolution was brewing, a technological shift so profound that it would not only challenge their supremacy, but would ultimately render their entire mode of warfare obsolete. Their hunters were about to become their hunted. The shockwaves from Pearl Harbor had not yet settled when a new, more insidious threat began to stalk the U.S. Navy across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Unlike the concentrated, cinematic destruction of the aerial attack, this enemy was a phantom. It left no wake, offered no silhouette against the horizon, and struck without warning from the infinite dark below. For the American fleet, reeling and rebuilding, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force presented a tactical nightmare of unparalleled proportions. How do you hunt an enemy you cannot find, in a domain you cannot effectively see, across an ocean that defies comprehensive surveillance? The problem was one of sheer physics and mind-boggling scale. The Pacific Ocean is the largest single geographic feature on Earth. Within its millions of square miles, a submarine, even one as large as a Japanese I-boat, was a needle in a liquid, pitch-black haystack. The primary American anti-submarine weapon at the war's outset was the destroyer, a surface vessel designed for speed and surface combat. Its tools were primitive in the face of this new challenge. The main sensor was ASDIC, or as the Americans called it, sonar, sound navigation and ranging. This technology sent a ping of sound through the water, hoping for an echo off a submerged hull. In theory, it was a submarine's worst enemy. In the reality of the early Pacific War, it was nearly useless. The limitations were crippling. Sonar was effective only at short ranges, typically less than 2,000 yards. A submarine could easily lie in wait, hear the pings of an approaching destroyer, and maneuver to avoid its narrow search beam. The sonar would also lose a target once a destroyer got too close, as the submarine would slip into the acoustic blind spot directly beneath the ship's hull. Furthermore, the sonar was useless against a surfaced submarine, which was how the Japanese boats spent most of their transit time, running on their powerful diesel engines. They were, for all intents and purposes, invisible until they chose to submerge for an attack, or until a lookout spotted their tiny profile on the surface, often too late. The American response was initially one of desperation and brute force. Convoys were formed, and destroyer screens patrolled their perimeters in frantic, zigzagging patterns. When a submarine was suspected, or more often, after it had already struck, the response was to saturate the area with depth charges. These were barrels of high explosives set to detonate at a specific depth. The tactic was as crude as it was terrifying. A destroyer would race over a suspected position and roll dozens of charges off its stern racks, hoping to get lucky. The deep, concussive thump, thump, thump of the explosions underwater was a sound that chilled the bones of every sailor, Allied and Axis alike. But it was a lottery. Without accurate, real-time data on the submarine's depth and position, depth charging was largely an act of psychological warfare, a hope to either cripple the boat through a near miss or force it deep enough to cause leaks or mechanical failure. It was a weapon of area denial, not of precision killing. The human toll of this ineffective defense was staggering. The sinking of the aircraft carrier USS Wasp by the I-19 was a national tragedy, but it was the constant, grinding attrition of the merchant fleet that truly threatened to strangle the Allied war effort. Tankers carrying precious aviation fuel from California to the forward bases, freighters loaded with ammunition for the Marines on Guadalcanal, troopships filled with young soldiers, all were prey. A single torpedo from the unseen hunter could turn a vital supply ship into a funeral pyre in minutes. The feeling of vulnerability was paralyzing. Every day, across thousands of miles of ocean, American sailors steamed through a hunting ground, knowing a lethal predator could be tracking them from just beyond the visible horizon, or lurking silently 100 feet beneath their keel. There was no front line. The entire ocean was the battlefield. Commanders in Pearl Harbor and Washington faced a strategic quandary. They could not win a war of island hopping and fleet engagement if their logistical backbone was being severed piece by piece. The German U-boat threat in the Atlantic, while severe, was being met with increasingly effective countermeasures like improved radar and code breaking. But the Japanese submarine was a different kind of foe, faster, larger, and operating in a theater where the distances were far greater and the bases of support far fewer. They weren't just hunting convoys, they were stalking warships, laying mines, and conducting reconnaissance with impunity. A profound and galling sense of impotence set in. The U.S. Navy possessed the industrial might to build ships faster than Japan could sink them, but it could not replace the experienced sailors, the vital aircraft, and the precious time lost to these phantom attacks. The ocean, which should have been a highway for American power, had become a domain of profound fear. The Japanese since weekend held the strategic initiative beneath the waves. They had turned the fundamental nature of the sea, its depth, its darkness, its silence, into their primary weapon. To win, the Americans needed to do more than just build more destroyers and drop more depth charges. They needed to invent a new way of seeing. They needed to turn the ocean from a cloak of invisibility for the hunter into a transparent prison. They needed to find a way to make the silent depths scream with the location of their enemy. The solution would not come from the bridge of a destroyer, but from the quiet holes of science. The desperate reports from the Pacific, of phantom torpedoes, burning carriers, and vanished supply ships, did not just land on the desks of admirals in Washington. They also landed, in the form of classified briefings and urgent requests, in the quiet holes of American academia and industrial research labs. The problem of the invisible submarine was, at its core, not a military problem but a physics problem. And to solve it, the United States would mobilize its greatest secret weapon, its scientific and industrial brain trust, unleashing them from theoretical abstraction and into the brutal, practical world of war. The genesis of the solution lay in the nascent, pre-war science of acoustics and anti-submarine warfare, ASW, which was, in 1941, in a primitive state. The primary shipboard sonar, or echo-ranging equipment, was a tactical tool with a limited scope. It was like a man in a pitch-black room, blinking a small flashlight and hoping to catch a glimpse of a moving target before it struck him. It was wholly inadequate for the strategic problem of surveilling the vast approaches to a fleet or a convoy. What was needed was not a better flashlight, but a way to turn on the lights for the entire room. This required a fundamental shift from active, ship-based pinging to passive, wide-area listening. The theoretical groundwork for this had been laid years before, born from an unlikely source, the study of earthquakes. Geophysicists had long used networks of sensitive seismometers to triangulate the epicenter of tremors across a continent. The key insight that migrated from geology to naval warfare was the concept of the array. A single listening post could tell you a sound was present. But multiple, geographically separated listening posts, their data correlated, could tell you precisely where that sound was coming from. Apply this principle to the ocean, and you had the seed of a revolutionary idea, a field of floating, automated listening posts that could pinpoint a submarine's location by the noise of its engines and propellers. Turning this theory into a battlefield weapon became the mission of a new, secretive branch of the American war machine, one that fused uniformed officers with civilian boffins, scientists, and engineers. The most famous of these was the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, and within it, Division 6, dedicated to submarine warfare. Led by some of the brightest minds from institutions like Harvard, MIT, and Bell Labs, these men were given a single, staggering mandate: render the ocean transparent. Their creation was the sonobuoy. On the surface, it was a deceptively simple device, a cylindrical buoy, about 3 feet long, containing a hydrophone, an underwater microphone, a radio transmitter, and a power source. It was designed to be dropped from an aircraft. Upon hitting the water, it would deploy, suspending the hydrophone at a predetermined depth while the buoy itself floated, transmitting any acoustic signals it picked up back to the aircraft via radio. But the simplicity of the individual unit belied the system's revolutionary complexity. The first challenge was the hydrophone itself. It had to be sensitive enough to detect the low-frequency rumble of a submarine's diesel engines or the high-frequency whine of its electric motors from miles away, yet robust enough to survive the shock of an airdrop. The engineers at Bell Labs and Columbia University's Hudson Laboratories worked tirelessly, developing new piezoelectric ceramics that could convert the subtle pressure waves of sound into clear electrical signals. The second, more profound challenge was the problem of classification. The ocean is not a silent place. It is a cacophony of biological and geological noise, the clicking of shrimp, the songs of whales, the sound of rain on the surface, the groan of shifting currents. A simple listening device would be overwhelmed. The scientists had to develop a way to distinguish the specific acoustic signature of a submarine from this natural background symphony. This required pioneering work in audio filtration and frequency analysis, the great-grandfather of the modern sound analysis software used today. They learned to identify the unique harmonic frequencies, the specific note, of a submarine's machinery. The final piece of the puzzle was deployment and networking. A single sonobuoy was a curiosity. A field of them, laid in a strategic pattern by a patrolling aircraft like the PBY Catalina or the TBF Avenger, became a lethal trap. This is where the gambit moved from the laboratory to the battlefield. An aircraft, with its speed and altitude, could cover hundreds of square miles that would take a flotilla of destroyers days to search. It could fly over a suspected area, deploying a string of buoys in a calculated grid, a barrier, or a field. Then, it would circle at a safe distance, its radio operator listening intently on multiple channels. When a buoy picked up a promising contact, the operator could switch to a directional antenna and, by comparing the signal strength from different buoys in the field, triangulate the submarine's position with shocking accuracy. This was the system that began to emerge from the labs in 1942 and 1943. It was a product of unprecedented collaboration. University physicists defined the acoustic principles. Industrial engineers from companies like General Electric and Raytheon miniaturized and ruggedized the electronics. The Navy's own specialists defined the tactical requirements. It was a messy, frantic, and incredibly expensive process, fueled by the absolute urgency of the losses at sea. The scientists, many of whom had never seen the ocean before the war, had gambled their reputations on a radical idea. They had taken an abstract principle from geophysics and fused it with cutting-edge electronics and audacious aviation tactics. They were creating not just a new device, but an entirely new domain of warfare, networked, electronic, anti-submarine hunting. The first batches of these secret weapons were shipped to the Pacific with technicians who often had to train the flight crews on their use in theater. Their gambit was in play. Soon, the phantoms of the deep would discover that their silent world was no longer silent. It was now wired for sound, and their every move was being broadcast to an executioner in the sky. The war beneath the Pacific had settled into a grim rhythm for the crews of the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarines. They were the masters of the deep, operating with a confident, almost ritualistic, understanding of their environment. The ocean was a realm of shadow and silence, their primary ally. Their hydrophone operators, trained to listen for the specific, recognizable sounds of war, the thrashing screws of a destroyer, the churning rumble of a merchantman's engine, the distinctive pings of Allied sonar, crouched in their stations, their ears attuned to the acoustic landscape of the hunt. Then, in late 1943, the silence began to speak in a new, unfamiliar tongue. It started sporadically, in patches of ocean that should have been empty. A hydrophone operator aboard the I-26 on patrol east of the Solomon Islands first dismissed it as an anomaly. It was a ping, but unlike anything he had catalogued before. It was shorter, higher in frequency, and seemingly disembodied. Standard Allied warship sonar had a certain rhythm, a predictable pattern of active search that betrayed the vessel's movements and intent. This was different. It was a single, isolated ping. Then nothing. Minutes later, another from a slightly different bearing. Then silence again. It was acoustic ghosting, a signal with no discernible source. Aboard the submarine, I-32, operating near their vital American anchorage at Ulithi, the experience was even more unnerving. The hydrophone operator reported a cluster of faint, metallic splashes from the surface, followed shortly after by the emergence of these strange, intermittent pings. They seemed to be coming from multiple, stationary points, forming a loose, shifting grid around their position. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Tetsuru Yeno, ordered a change in depth and course, a standard evasion tactic. Yet, the pings seemed to follow, or rather, they seemed to be everywhere. There was no Doppler shift, no increasing or decreasing intensity that would indicate a moving hunter. It was as if the ocean itself had grown ears. Initial reports filtering back to the 6th Fleet, the Japanese Submarine Command, were confused and contradictory. The most common theory, born of a warrior's logic, was that they were encountering a new, highly advanced type of American destroyer or a small, stealthy patrol craft equipped with a novel sonar system. Some captains speculated about sonar decoys, devices meant to confuse and disorient. But the behavior defied explanation. These sources did not maneuver like ships. They appeared, broadcast their short, enigmatic signal, and then vanished, only to be replaced by others. They formed patterns that seemed both random and intentional, like a net being drawn shut by an unseen hand. The psychological effect on the crews was profound and corrosive. The central pillar of submarine warfare is stealth. A detected submarine is a vulnerable submarine. The familiar, known threat of a destroyer's sonar, while dangerous, was part of the calculated risk. You could hear it coming, you could plot its course, you could dive deep and try to slip away. This new phenomenon offered no such clarity. It created a pervasive sense of paranoia. The deep, which had once been their sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every strange creak of their own boat's hull, every grumble from the ocean depths, was scrutinized. Was that a natural sound? Or was it a response to one of those phantom pings? Aboard the I-176-, a veteran boat with a string of kills to its name, the tension reached a breaking point. They had been tracking a convoy south of Guam when the pings began. They were not the loud, aggressive pings of an attacking warship, but softer, more inquisitive signals. They came in clusters from multiple directions. The captain, Commander Zenji Arita, a seasoned and unflappable officer, felt a chill he had never known in combat. He later wrote in his diary of the experience, "It was as if we were a spider in a bowl, and a giant was tapping on the rim, listening for our movement. We could not see the giant. We could only hear the taps, and know that we were no longer alone in the dark." He ordered an emergency dive to test depth, running silent and cutting all non-essential systems. The crew held their breath, the only sound the anxious beating of their own hearts and the faint, maddening ping, ping, ping from the hydrophones. The sounds did not fade. They persisted, a ghostly chorus from the void. The Americans were not hunting them with a single, known predator. They had somehow seeded the ocean with invisible sentinels. The Americans, it seemed, had found a way to make the very water betray them. The silent hunters were now the ones being listened to, their every move monitored and reported by instruments they could not see and barely understood. The ocean, their ancient domain, was no longer a place of hiding. It had become a transparent prison, and the walls were beginning to whisper. The fragmented, increasingly alarmed reports from the frontline submarines ceased being isolated curiosities and began to form a pattern, a terrifying mosaic of a new kind of warfare. In the headquarters of the 6th Fleet in Japan, staff officers pored over the dispatches, their initial skepticism giving way to a profound and deepening unease. They were facing an intelligence crisis of the highest order. An enemy had deployed a new weapon, and they could not even define its physical form, let alone its tactical application. Their ghosts in the water were systematically dismantling their operational confidence. The first and most pressing task was identification. The initial theory, a new type of American destroyer or subchaser, was quickly dismissed. The acoustic evidence was irrefutable. These signals were stationary or, at best, drifted with the current. They appeared in areas far from any known Allied naval patrol routes. They were also deployed in numbers that defied logic. No navy had enough ships to saturate such vast areas of the ocean with individual sonar platforms. A more outlandish theory emerged. Perhaps the Americans had developed a miniature, self-propelled sonar drone, a kind of robotic fish that could swarm a submarine. But the signals showed no propulsion sounds, only the stark, periodic ping. It was a junior communications officer, Lieutenant Yamada, who first pieced together the crucial clue. He was cross-referencing a report from the I-181-, which described hearing faint splashes preceding the appearance of the pings, with an after-action report from a floatplane pilot. The pilot, conducting a reconnaissance mission near the Admiralty Islands, had reported seeing American patrol aircraft, PBY Cataliners, flying low and slow, apparently dropping small, cylindrical objects into the sea. The pilot had assumed they were depth charges being deployed in a random, preventative pattern. But Yamato connected the events. The splashes were the sound of objects entering the water from the air. The pings were the objects themselves. The revelation was a shock, but it only deepened the mystery. What were these objects? How did they work? The concept of a sonobuoy, a disposable, airdropped, passive listening device, was so alien to the Japanese military mindset that it was difficult to conceptualize. Their own technological development was geared toward larger, more complex, and more powerful weapons, the giant I-400 submarines, the Type 95 torpedo. The American approach, by contrast, seemed to be one of distributed, disposable electronics. It was a philosophy of warfare that valued quantity, networking, and strategic coverage over individual unit quality. A desperate effort was launched to recover one of the devices. Orders were sent to every submarine at sea, if operating in an area with the ghost signals, and if conditions permitted, they were to attempt to surface and retrieve one of the buoys. This was a mission fraught with peril. Surfacing in an area known to be under American aerial surveillance was tantamount to suicide. For weeks, the attempts failed. Submarines would surface at night, only to find the buoys elusive in the dark or to be forced into emergency dives by the sound of approaching aircraft. The breakthrough, of sorts, came from their I-10, a submarine equipped with a reconnaissance plane. On a daring mission, their I-10 launched its Glen floatplane to overfly a sector where the pings had been dense. The pilot, flying at extreme low level, spotted several of the buoys. His report was meticulous. They were simple, metal cylinders, floating low in the water, with a small antenna protruding from the top. There were no visible moving parts, no signs of propulsion. They were, to all appearances, inert. This was the final, baffling piece of the puzzle. The Americans had filled the ocean with cheap, simple, static objects that were somehow capable of detecting a submarine and reporting its presence. The technological gap was not in power, but in concept. The Japanese had been perfecting the sword, while the Americans had invented defense. The strategic implications, once understood, were paralyzing. The staff at 6th Fleet realized that their entire doctrine of submarine warfare was now obsolete. Their boats were designed for long-range, independent operations, relying on stealth and surprise. Now, stealth was compromised. An area deemed safe could be seeded with these buoys in a matter of hours by a single patrol plane. A submarine transiting to its patrol zone could now be tracked, its course and speed calculated, and an interception plotted long before it ever reached its target. A grim memo circulated among their high command. It stated that the Americans were no longer simply hunting Japanese submarines. They were mapping them. They were turning the ocean into a managed battle space, a grid where any acoustic signature could be triangulated, identified, and targeted. Their ghosts were not the weapon itself, they were the targeting system for a larger, more comprehensive kill chain. The lonely, heroic duel between submarine and destroyer was over. It had been replaced by a cold, impersonal, and terrifyingly efficient system of detection and destruction. The ocean, the very element that gave the submarine its power, had been turned against them. They were no longer hunters in a dark forest, they were mice in a laboratory maze, and the scientists had just turned on the lights. The mystery was solved, but the solution offered no solace, only a clear view of their own impending obsolescence. To the Japanese, the sonobuoy was an enigmatic ghost, a signal without a source. But in reality, it was a masterpiece of pragmatic engineering, a device whose simplicity of purpose belied the profound technological leap it represented. It was not a single invention, but a system, a carefully orchestrated symphony of physics, electronics, and logistics designed to accomplish one thing: shatter the silence that protected the submarine. Understanding its anatomy is to understand how the United States turned the Pacific Ocean from a submarine sanctuary into a monitored killing field. The life of a sonobuoy began not at sea, but in the sterile environment of American factories like those of Raytheon and General Electric. The standard AN/CRT-1 sonobuoy, the workhorse of the mid-war period, was a study in efficient packaging. It was a cylinder just over 3 feet long and 5 inches in diameter, weighing roughly 30 pounds. Its shell was not heavy steel, but a lightweight, corrodable metal like magnesium. This was a crucial design feature. It was meant to be used once and then sink, preventing technological compromise. Inside this unassuming tube was a marvel of miniaturized technology, comprising 4 key systems, all powered by a simple, seawater-activated battery. The hydrophone, the ear of the system. At the core of the buoy was the hydrophone, an underwater microphone based on piezoelectric crystals. These crystals, often made of Rochelle salt or later, barium titanate, had a unique property. When subjected to the pressure waves of sound traveling through water, they would generate a tiny electrical voltage. This allowed them to convert the complex acoustic signature of a submarine, the specific frequencies of its diesel engines, the cavitating rhythm of its screws, the whine of its reduction gears, into an electrical signal. This was the first, critical translation, from the hidden mechanics of the submarine into a quantifiable electronic impulse. Early hydrophones were omnidirectional, but later models became directional, able to provide a bearing to the target, vastly improving the accuracy of the network. The transmitter, the voice in the ether. The faint electrical signal from the hydrophone was useless unless it could be communicated. This was the task of the radio transmitter. Using a vacuum tube oscillator and an amplifier, the buoy took the acoustic signal and impressed it upon a VHF radio carrier wave. A short, collapsible antenna, deployed upon water impact, would then broadcast this signal continuously. Each buoy in a field was pre-tuned to a different radio frequency, allowing a single aircraft to monitor multiple buoys simultaneously without their signals interfering. The radio operator in the aircraft, wearing headphones, would listen to a cacophony of ocean sounds, the clicks of shrimp, the songs of whales, and trained his ear to pick out the mechanical, rhythmic signature of a man-made vessel. The deployer, from sky to sea. The system of deployment was as ingenious as the buoy itself. The buoys were loaded into chutes on the underside of aircraft like the PBY Catalina, the TBF Avenger, and later, the purpose-built P-2 Neptune. When the aircraft reached a designated point, the crew would release a buoy. Upon hitting the water, a series of automated processes initiated. A water-soluble plug would dissolve, allowing seawater to flood a chamber and activate the battery. A canister of compressed gas would inflate a flotation collar to keep the buoy upright. A cable would spool out, lowering the hydrophone to its optimal listening depth, typically between 50 and 150 feet, placing it beneath the thermal layers that could bend and trap sound, putting it directly in the acoustic path of a submerged submarine. The network, the sum greater than its parts. A single sonobuoy was a sentry. A field of them was an inescapable net. The tactical doctrine was straightforward. An aircraft, guided by intelligence or patrol patterns, would fly to a suspected submarine contact area. It would then deploy a pattern of buoys, often in a line or a circle, with several miles between each one. The aircraft would then fly a racetrack pattern outside the perimeter of the field. Its radio operator scanning the preset frequencies. This is where the system achieved its true revolutionary power. When a submarine entered the field, its noise would be picked up by one or more buoys. By switching between frequencies and comparing the signal strength and, with directional buoys, the bearing, the crew could perform a crude form of triangulation. They could plot the submarine's location, its course, and its speed without ever getting close enough for the submarine to detect them. The aircraft, a silent, invisible manager of the battlefield, now held all the cards. It could vector in surface warships for the kill, or it could move in for its own attack, dropping homing torpedoes or depth charges with a precision previously unimaginable. The true genius of the sonobuoy system was its embodiment of American industrial and philosophical might. It was not a handcrafted weapon but a mass-produced, disposable tool. It accepted that individual units were expendable, but the network was indispensable. It represented a shift from hunting to surveillance, from reactive pursuit to proactive domain control. By dissecting the anatomy of a single, simple buoy, the Japanese would have understood that they were not fighting a better weapon, but a superior system. They had mastered the art of building a better predator. The Americans had mastered the science of building a better cage. For years, the deadly dance between submarine and hunter had followed a predictable, if terrifying, rhythm. The submarine would strike from the shadows. The hunter, a destroyer or patrol craft, would arrive later, enraged and blind, lashing out at the depths with depth charges in a display of brute force frustration. It was a reactive, often futile, exercise. But in 1944, the rhythm changed. The reactive became proactive. The blind became all-seeing. The hunter, now guided by an invisible network of ears in the water, became the orchestrator of a new, more clinical, and infinitely more terrifying form of destruction. The first confirmed kill using the integrated sonobuoy system was not merely an attack, it was a demonstration, a tactical proof of concept that sent a shockwave through both the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Submarine Force. The victim was the RO-105-, a medium-sized submarine operating south of Truk. The executioner was a US Navy TBF Avenger, part of an escort carrier group. The event unfolded with a chilling, methodical precision that was entirely new. The Avenger, piloted by Lieutenant J.G. Donald M. White, was on a routine patrol when he was vectored towards a suspected submarine contact based on distant intelligence. Reaching the area, White's crew deployed a field of 6 sonobuoys in a standard search pattern. For the first 20 minutes, the only sounds coming through their headphones were the usual background noise of the Pacific. Then, the radio operator stiffened. On buoy number 3's frequency, a low, rhythmic, mechanical drone had emerged from the aquatic static. It was the unmistakable sound of electric motors, a submerged submarine running silently, but not silently enough. White did not dive immediately to attack. Instead, he became a conductor. He circled at a safe altitude, monitoring the signals. He deployed 2 more buoys to tighten the net. By comparing the signal strength and, crucially, the slight delay in the sound's arrival at different buoys, his crew could now triangulate the submarine's position with an accuracy previously reserved for surface gunnery. They knew its course, its speed, and its depth. The RO-105 was no longer a phantom, it was a tracked asset on a plotted course, completely unaware that its every move was being broadcast to an aircraft 5,000 feet above. Only when the picture was complete did White make his move. He brought the Avenger around, lining up not on where the submarine was, but on where it would be. He descended. The submarine's hydrophone operator, if he was listening, would have heard only the final, screaming approach of the aircraft, far too late for evasive action. White released a pair of Mark 24 Fido torpedoes, another secret weapon. These were not dumb depth charges, they were acoustic homing torpedoes that, once entering the water, would listen for the sound of the submarine's screws and steer themselves toward the source. From the Avenger, the crew saw 2 geysers of water as the torpedoes entered the sea. Then, silence for a long moment, followed by a single, deep, muffled crump that reverberated through the water and was picked up loudly by every sonobuoy in the field. The mechanical drone on their headphones ceased abruptly, replaced by the sounds of collapsing metal and imploding compartments. A large oil slick and a field of bubbling debris soon rose to the surface, confirming the kill. The entire engagement had been a silent, remote-controlled execution. The submarine had never seen its attacker, never heard the telltale ping of a destroyer's sonar, never had a chance to fight back. It had simply been erased. News of this and other successful engagements spread rapidly through the US Navy's anti-submarine community. The effect was electrifying. For the first time, patrol aircraft had a reliable, repeatable method for finding and destroying enemy submarines. They were no longer just sentries, they were hunters. The tactics evolved with breathtaking speed. Killer hunter groups were formed, with one aircraft specializing in deploying and monitoring the buoy field, while others stood by as shooters, waiting to be vectored onto the precise coordinates provided by the network. For the Japanese submarine crews, the psychological impact was catastrophic. The experience of the RO-105's sister boats was not an isolated horror, but a new and terrifying norm. They began to report a chilling pattern, the appearance of the ghostly pings, followed not by the immediate threat of a destroyer, but by an ominous, waiting silence. Then, without warning, would come the attack, often from the air with weapons that seemed to seek them out. They developed a profound dread of American patrol aircraft, which they had previously considered a nuisance rather than a mortal threat. The aircraft were no longer just eyes in the sky, they were the brains of a vast, distributed nervous system that spanned the ocean itself. The fundamental relationship between hunter and hunted had been inverted. The submarine's greatest strength, its stealth, had been systematically nullified. No longer could they rely on the deep to hide them. Now, the deep itself was a medium of betrayal, carrying the sounds of their own propulsion to unseen, floating microphones that condemned them to death. The ocean was no longer their domain. It had been wired, monitored, and weaponized by their enemy. They were no longer the silent hunters. They had become the hunted, trapped in a cage of their own element, listening for the ghosts that signaled their own demise. The sinking of individual submarines, while devastating, was a tactical event. But for the command staff of the Japanese Sixth Fleet, a far more horrifying strategic picture was beginning to emerge from the fragmented reports of their captains. They were not merely facing a new weapon or a novel tactic. They were confronting a fundamental transformation of the battle space itself. The Americans were not just hunting submarines, they were methodically constructing a vast, automated, and ever-expanding surveillance grid across the Pacific Ocean. The sonobuoys were not merely devices, they were the individual nodes in a colossal, decentralized nervous system, and the ocean was its medium. This realization dawned not in a single flash of insight, but through the slow, chilling accumulation of data. Patrol reports from submarines operating across thousands of miles of ocean, from the frigid waters off the Aleutians to the steamy tropics of the Solomons, all began to tell the same story. Their ghost pings were not confined to areas around known Allied bases or active convoy routes. They were appearing along known Japanese transit routes, outside the entrances to remote atolls used for clandestine resupply, and in deep water channels previously considered safe for submerged navigation. The Americans, it became clear, were not simply reacting to submarine contacts. They were proactively seeding the ocean. The scale was incomprehensible to a military mind trained for fleet engagements and decisive battles. This was a campaign of pervasive, persistent surveillance. U.S. Navy patrol aircraft, operating from a growing network of island bases, began flying systematic patterns not to hunt, but to plant. Each flight was like a farmer sowing a deadly crop. A single PBY Catalina could carry and deploy 24 sonobuoys. In a single sortie, it could establish an acoustic barrier 50 miles long. A squadron of aircraft could create a surveillance zone the size of a small sea. And these fields were not temporary. As buoys expired and sank, they were replaced, their positions shifted based on the evolving intelligence picture, creating a dynamic, living grid that adapted to Japanese movements. The true genius, and terror, of the grid was its passivity. A Japanese submarine captain, trained to listen for the active ping of a searching destroyer, could take evasive action. But the sonobuoy grid was largely silent. It did not announce its presence with aggressive probing. It simply listened. A submarine could transit through a buoy field, completely unaware it was there, its own acoustic signature, the rumble of its engines, the cavitation of its screws, being faithfully recorded and transmitted. The first indication of danger would not be the sound of a hunter, but the sudden, inexplicable arrival of one, its attack run perfectly calculated based on data the submarine had unknowingly provided minutes or even hours before. This created a state of profound psychological dislocation for the Japanese submariners. The ocean, once a realm of absolute blackness and comforting silence, had become a panopticon. Every mile traveled felt like a potential step into a trap. The constant, low-grade anxiety eroded morale and frayed nerves. Crews, once confident and aggressive, became hesitant and paranoid. Captains began to second-guess their routes, opting for longer, more circuitous paths to avoid areas where buoys were suspected, burning precious fuel and reducing their time on station. The mere suspicion of a buoy field could effectively deny a vast area of ocean to Japanese submarines, a form of control achieved without firing a shot. The grid also fundamentally altered the strategic value of the Japanese submarine force. Their missions of reconnaissance and fleet support became suicidal. Attempting to shadow an American carrier task force now meant steaming into a mobile, dense cloud of sonobuoys deployed by the screen of destroyers and aircraft that constantly surrounded the fleet. The submarine became the observed, not the observer. Similarly, missions to resupply besieged garrisons, like Rabaul or Truk, became near-certain death sentences. The approaches to these harbors were among the first areas to be densely seeded, turning them into lethal funnels. In headquarters in Tokyo, staff officers stared at large operational maps of the Pacific. They began to visualize it not as a blank blue expanse, but as a crisscrossed web of American acoustic coverage. Key choke points were permanently monitored. Transit routes were intermittently patrolled. Operational areas were saturated. The Americans, they realized, were applying the same industrial logic that produced Liberty ships and Essex-class carriers to the domain of surveillance. They were winning not by building a better trap, but by building a better cage, a cage made of sound, encompassing millions of square miles. The ocean was no longer a neutral territory. It was no longer the ally of the silent service. It had been colonized, digitized before the age of digits, transformed into a hostile environment that reported their presence and enabled their destruction. The grid of sand was an invisible fortress wall, and the Japanese submarine fleet was on the wrong side of it, trapped in a shrinking world where every sound they made was a potential death warrant. The Americans had turned the fundamental nature of the sea against them. The ocean was listening, and it was telling the Americans everything they needed to know. The most devastating weapon is not one that destroys the body, but one that shatters the spirit. For the crews of the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarines, the creeping understanding that their primary advantage, their sacred cloak of invisibility, had been systematically stripped away was a psychological catastrophe far more damaging than any single depth charge attack. The ocean depths, once their sanctuary, had become a place of pervasive dread, a transparent prison where every sound they made felt like a broadcast of their own location to an unseen executioner. Before their sonobuoy, submarine warfare was a contest of nerves played out in absolute darkness. A captain's skill was measured by his patience, his silence, and his ability to become one with the abyss. The greatest threat was the active ping of a destroyer's sonar, a sound that, while terrifying, was at least knowable. It was the sound of a hunter who was itself blind, lashing out in a specific direction. A skilled captain could use that sound against his pursuer, diving deeper, slipping into thermal layers, lying motionless on the bottom, or releasing oil and debris to simulate a kill. It was a duel, and there were rules, however brutal. The sonobuoy network erased those rules. There was no single hunter to outwit. There was only the grid, an omnipresent, impersonal, and utterly unfeeling system. A submarine's crew could now be living on borrowed time without ever hearing a single aggressive ping. The silence itself became suspicious. The normal, reassuring sounds of their own boat, the hum of the ventilation, the subtle whir of the gyro compass, the quiet chatter of the crew, now felt like a reckless noise discipline violation. Men found themselves speaking in whispers, even deep beneath the waves, as if the Americans' hydrophones could pick up their very conversations. This constant, low-grade anxiety had a corrosive effect on operational effectiveness. The aggressive, hunter-killer ethos that had defined the early war since weakened crews evaporated, replaced by a defensive, almost fugitive mentality. Patrols that were once characterized by bold thrusts into enemy waters became cautious, hesitant probes. Captains who had once eagerly sought out contact now actively avoided it, interpreting any unusual sound, a school of fish, a shifting current, as the precursor to an attack. The primary mission shifted from seeking and destroying the enemy to simply surviving the transit to their patrol zone and returning home. Aboard the submarines, the strain manifested in tangible ways. The hydrophone operator, once a key but peripheral member of the crew, now held the lives of every man in his hands. The pressure on these young men was immense. They would sit for hours in their isolated stations, headphones clamped to their ears, listening to the symphony of the sea, tasked with distinguishing the faint, mechanical whisper of a distant patrol aircraft's buoy from the natural cacophony. A mistake, a missed signal or a false alarm, could mean death. Many operators succumbed to auditory hallucinations, hearing phantom pings and engine noises in the natural white noise of the ocean, leading to frantic, unnecessary crash dives that drained batteries and frayed nerves further. Sleep, always a precious commodity on a submarine, became nearly impossible. The fear of a silent, homing torpedo like the Mark 24 Fido was particularly potent. Unlike depth charges, which gave a crew moments to brace for a concussive shock, a homing torpedo offered no warning. One moment, there would be the normal hum of the boat, the next, a single, catastrophic explosion against the pressure hull. This knowledge bred a special kind of terror. Men would lie in their bunks, staring at the curved steel above them, imagining the sound of metal screws, hearing them through the water, homing in relentlessly. The very identity of the submarine sailor was built upon the concept of being a silent hunter. It was a title that conferred elite status, a sense of superiority over the surface-bound sailors who plied the waves' invisible, vulnerable ships. That identity was now in ruins. They were no longer hunters, they were prey. The confidence that had allowed them to operate solo, for months at a time, in the heart of enemy territory was gone. They were now like mice in a field, knowing that a hawk was circling high above, its vision piercing the very ground that hid them. A profound sense of fatalism began to seep into the fleet. In letters and diaries, sailors wrote not of glory, but of the statistical improbability of completing a patrol. They spoke of the ocean as being cursed or poisoned by the Americans. The belief in their technological superiority, a cornerstone of their early war morale, was shattered. They had believed their boats were the finest in the world, but they were being systematically eradicated by what seemed like a simple, almost crude, technological concept, a network of floating, disposable microphones. The end of stealth warfare meant more than just a change in tactics, it meant the end of a warrior culture. The submarine arm of the IJN, once a strategic weapon meant to bleed the American fleet, was being reduced to a fugitive force, its spirit broken not by a decisive battle, but by the silent, inexorable pressure of a grid they could not see, could not fight, and could no longer escape. The ocean, their home and their weapon, had been turned against them. There was truly no place left to hide. The psychological evisceration of the Japanese submarine crew was a human tragedy. But its strategic consequence was a geopolitical catastrophe that strangled the Japanese war effort across the entire Pacific theater. The neutralization of the undersea domain was not merely the loss of a single weapons system, it was the collapse of a fundamental pillar of Japan's defensive strategy. With their submarines rendered ineffective, Japan lost its ability to interdict the American logistical machine, to gather vital intelligence, and to sustain its own sprawling, isolated island garrisons. The ocean, once a defensive moat, became an American highway, and Japan was left stranded on its shrinking archipelago. The most critical failure was in the campaign against American logistics. The early war success of Japanese submarines against Allied shipping, while often overshadowed by the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, had been significant. But as the sonobuoy grid expanded, this threat simply vanished. American merchantmen and troop transports, organized into the massive Magic Carpet convoys, now steamed with an impunity that would have been unthinkable in 1942. The sea lanes from Pearl Harbor to the Solomon Islands, from San Francisco to the Marianas, became secure arteries, pumping a relentless tide of men, machines, and material toward the Japanese homeland. Tanks, ammunition, aviation fuel, and fresh divisions flowed westward almost entirely unmolested. The American strategy of island hopping was entirely dependent on this unimpeded logistical train. Without it, each marine landing would have been a precarious undertaking, vulnerable to being starved of reinforcements and supplies. The sonobuoy, a simple listening device, thus became the unsung guardian of America's industrial might, ensuring that the products of its arsenal of democracy reached the front lines without interference. Simultaneously, the Japanese submarine fleet lost its role as the eyes of the fleet. The large, aircraft-carrying I-boats had been designed for long-range reconnaissance, to shadow the American fleet and provide warning of its movements. This capability was utterly extinguished. Attempting to get close enough to a U.S. task force to observe it was now a suicide mission. The carriers and their escorts operated within a mobile, traveling bubble of sonobuoys and radar picket destroyers. A Japanese submarine would be detected long before it could even catch a glimpse of the fleet, and would be hunted and destroyed without ever filing its report. This strategic blindness left the Japanese combined fleet groping in the dark. The stunning American victories at the Philippine Sea and the Leyte Gulf were enabled, in part, by this lack of advanced, accurate intelligence from submarine pickets. The U.S. Navy could maneuver with operational freedom, its movements shrouded in mystery, while the Japanese fleet was repeatedly caught by surprise. Perhaps the most poignant strategic failure was in the realm of blockade running and reinforcement. As the American news tightened, countless Japanese garrisons were cut off on bypassed islands like Rabaul, Truk, and countless atolls across the Central Pacific. Their only lifeline was the submarine. The I-boats and smaller RO boats were stripped of their torpedoes and crammed with sacks of rice, medical supplies, and ammunition in a desperate effort to sustain these isolated armies. These missions, known as use or transport operations, became the primary duty of the surviving submarine force. And they became a slaughter. The Americans knew exactly where these submarines had to go. The approaches to these besieged harbors were some of the most heavily seeded areas of the entire sonobuoy grid. The submarines, burdened and unmaneuverable, had to follow predictable courses to reach the precise landing points. They were sitting ducks. U.S. patrol aircraft waited for them like spiders at the edge of a web. One by one, these lifelines were severed. Their I-169-, loaded with food for Truk, was depth-charged and lost with all hands. Their I-177-, carrying ammunition for Rabaul, was sent to the bottom by the destroyer escort USS Samuel S. Miles. The loss of these boats and their vital cargoes condemned thousands of Japanese soldiers to a slow death by starvation and disease, a grim testament to the complete Allied control of the sea lanes. By 1944, the Japanese submarine force had been strategically neutered. It could not protect their homeland from invasion by disrupting the enemy's buildup. It could not provide warning of the enemy's approach. It could not even feed its own stranded soldiers. The fleet of sophisticated, silent hunters had been rendered technologically and tactically obsolete. The numbers tell the final, grim story. In 1942, Japanese submarines sank over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping. By 1944, that number had plummeted to near insignificance, while their own losses soared to an unsustainable 70% casualty rate. The strategic implication was absolute. Control of the undersea domain meant control of the surface domain, which in turn meant control of the air above it. By winning the secret war of sound beneath the waves, the United States secured its ability to project power across the Pacific at will. Japan's submarines, once a weapon of strategic reach, were now confined to the coastal waters of the home islands, a symbol of an empire besieged and cut off from the world, its defensive moat drained, and its fate sealed. The final echoes of the Pacific War faded, leaving behind sunken hulls and a reshaped world order. The sonobuoy, a humble cylinder of magnesium and electronics, had proven to be one of the conflict's most revolutionary weapons. But its true legacy was not confined to the destruction of the Imperial Japanese submarine fleet. Its victory signaled something far more profound, the dawn of a new era in combat. The sonobuoy was the primitive, yet functional, progenitor of the digitized battlefield, the first practical implementation of a networked sensory grid that would fundamentally redefine the nature of warfare for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The core innovation was not the hydrophone or the radio, but the concept they embodied: distributed, integrated sensing. For the first time in history, a battle space was managed not by the direct observation of individual combatants, but by a system that fused data from multiple, dispersed sources into a single, coherent picture. The pilot in his Avenger was not just a pilot, he was a node, a central processor for a network of acoustic sensors. This was a radical departure from the linear, platform-centric warfare that had dominated for millennia. The individual weapon, the aircraft, the destroyer, was no longer the decisive unit. The decisive unit was the network itself. This paradigm shift became the foundational principle of post-war anti-submarine warfare, ASW. The Cold War, a silent, desperate duel with Soviet nuclear submarines, was an arms race defined by the lessons learned against the Japanese. The simple CRT-1 sonobuoy evolved into a family of sophisticated devices. Passive buoys became more sensitive, but were joined by active buoys that could emit their own pings, and later, by specialized buoys that could detect a submarine's magnetic anomaly or its low-frequency radio emissions. The processing moved from the strained ears of a radio operator to the blinking lights of onboard computers in aircraft like the P-3 Orion, which could monitor dozens of buoys simultaneously, using primitive algorithms to classify contacts and filter out false returns. The network expanded in scale and integration. It was no longer just a single aircraft and its buoy field. It became a strategic system. SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System, a vast network of hydrophone arrays fixed to the ocean floor, created a permanent, continental-scale listening wall. Patrol aircraft, surface ships with towed sonar arrays, and attack submarines now all fed their data into a growing, fused intelligence picture. A Soviet submarine leaving its base in the Kolar Peninsula could be tracked by SOSUS, its position refined by a passing P-3, and a hunter-killer submarine quietly vectored into position for a trailing mission. This was the sonobuoy grid of 1944, magnified to a global scale and accelerated to near real time. The ocean, for the superpowers, had become entirely transparent. The legacy, however, exploded far beyond the undersea domain. The concept of the networked battlefield migrated to land and air. In the latter half of the 20th century, the U.S. military began developing the technologies and doctrines that would culminate in what is now known as network-centric warfare. The fundamental idea that shared awareness and information superiority can translate into decisive competitive advantage is a direct descendant of the sonobuoy's success. One can draw a direct conceptual line from a field of sonobuoys to the modern digitized army. The individual soldier, equipped with a GPS and radio, is a sensor node. His armored vehicle, with its thermal sights and battlefield management system, is another. An unmanned aerial vehicle, UAV, loitering overhead is a third. All feed data into a common operational picture, giving a commander an unprecedented, God's-eye view of the battlefield. This is the terrestrial sonobuoy grid, allowing for coordinated, precise, and devastatingly effective operations. The destruction of an enemy unit is no longer the result of a single lucky engagement, but the calculated output of a synchronized network that saw the enemy, targeted him, and directed a weapon onto him, often from beyond his visual range. Similarly, in the air, systems like the AWACS, Airborne Warning and Control System, aircraft function as their pilot in the Avenger for an entire theater of operations. It manages a grid of friendly aircraft, directing them against threats based on a fused picture of radar and electronic intelligence, much like the TBF Avenger was directed against a submarine by its field of buoys. The sonobuoy's true victory was therefore intellectual. It proved that the integration of sensors, communications, and shooters could create a synergistic effect far greater than the sum of their parts. It demonstrated that information, properly collected and disseminated, could be as destructive as high explosives. It shifted the paradigm of military power from mass and armor to information and connectivity. The humble buoy, born from the urgent need to counter a silent hunter, ultimately taught the world how to wire the entire battle space for sound, for sight, and for data. It was the first, faint signal of the information age of warfare, an age where victory belongs not to the side with the strongest arm, but to the side with the most complete and swiftly shared picture of the fight. The ocean was merely the first domain to be networked. The rest of the world would follow. The history of naval warfare is a chronicle of visible power, the towering wooden hulls at Trafalgar, the thunderous broadsides of ironclads, the terrifying silhouette of a carrier battle group on the horizon. Yet, in the vast, lightless theater of the Pacific War, the most decisive weapon was not something that could be seen, but something that could be heard. It was not the roar of a cannon, but the simple, metallic ping of an echo, and later, the silent, listening intent of a hydrophone. This was a war fought not with projectiles of steel, but with pulses of acoustic energy. In the end, it was sound, harnessed, analyzed, and networked, that won the undersea war, signaling the irrevocable end of the submarine as a lone raider and the birth of the integrated, electronic battlefield. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Sensuiken represented the pinnacle of a certain kind of naval philosophy. They were instruments of individual prowess, technological quality, and strategic audacity. Their commanders were masters of their dark domain, relying on stealth, patience, and the immense, trackless expanse of the ocean to deliver their devastating blows. Their confidence was rooted in the belief that the sea would forever be their ally, providing an impenetrable cloak of invisibility. For them, the war beneath the waves was a series of solitary duels, a contest of wills between a lone hunter and its prey. The American sonobuoy, and the system it enabled, shattered this paradigm utterly. It was not merely a new tool, it was a new language of warfare. The solitary duel was replaced by the synchronized orchestra. The sonobuoy was the individual musician, the patrol aircraft the conductor, and the homing torpedo the crescendo. This system did not outfight the Japanese submarine, it outthought it. It did not contest the ocean space, it colonized its fundamental nature. The sea is a magnificent conductor of sound, and by planting countless, disposable ears within it, the Americans turned this physical property into a weapon. The ocean's greatest gift to the submarine, silence and depth, was systematically weaponized against it. The ping was no longer just a hunter's probe, it was the ticking of a clock counting down to a submarine's doom, or worse, the silent listening that preceded an attack with no warning at all. The victory was as much psychological as it was material. Long before a torpedo struck its hull, a Japanese submarine was already defeated. Its crew, once an elite brotherhood of confident hunters, was reduced to a state of paranoid vigilance, jumping at the spectral sounds of their own making. The tactical initiative, the very soul of the submarine, was stripped away. They were no longer the architects of ambush but the unwitting players in a script written by an unseen enemy. The relentless pressure of the grid eroded their morale, constrained their movements, and ultimately, broke their will to fight aggressively. They were transformed from a strategic threat into a fugitive fleet, their purpose narrowed to the desperate, often futile, task of survival. The echoes of this victory did not fade with the surrender in Tokyo Bay. They resonated through the decades of the Cold War, growing louder and more sophisticated. The simple sonobuoy grid of 1944 evolved into the global, persistent surveillance regime of SOSUS and the integrated ASW networks of the NATO allies. The principle remained unchanged: dominance through information. The nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, the most powerful and terrifying weapon ever put to sea, owes its existence to a deadly game of cat-and-mouse defined by the lessons learned against the I-boats. Its survivability depends on its ability to remain silent and hidden within an ocean that its opponents have spent 70 years wiring for sound. Furthermore, the legacy of the sonobuoy transcends the undersea domain. It was the prototype for the modern sensor node, the fundamental unit of the digitized battlefield. The concept of fusing data from dispersed, networked sources to create a unified picture of the battle space is the central tenet of 21st century warfare, from the drone feeds over a desert to the satellite constellations guiding precision munitions. The U.S. Navy pilot in his TBF Avenger, listening to his sonobuoys and vectoring in an attack, was the primitive forerunner of a commander in a centralized operations center, viewing the real-time movement of every friendly and enemy unit on a digital map. The sonobuoy taught the military world that victory belongs not to the side with the most powerful individual weapons, but to the side with the most complete, accurate, and swiftly shared information. In the deep, dark silence where the Sensweeken once ruled, the ghost of their defeat still lingers. It is not a ghost of fire and shrapnel, but of sound and data. It is the echo of a simple ping that announced the end of an era. It was the sound of stealth, the one absolute advantage of the submarine, being systematically dismantled. It was the sound of the ocean itself being conquered, not by a stronger navy, but by a smarter one. The silent hunters of Japan were ultimately defeated not by a louder noise, but by a more profound understanding of silence. They were defeated by an enemy that learned to listen, and in doing so, learned how to make the deep itself betray its most devoted masters.